Okay, yeah, so as usual, how this session will work is that we'll start by asking each of the panelists to kind of give their thoughts on the topic for a number of minutes. And then once we've kind of had this session, we'll kind of go into a question and answer session and open it up to the floor. So perhaps, Patrick, do you want to start off just by telling us about what you do and how that links to globalization?
I'll get started while we switch this thing on. So I've been asked to talk about youth leadership within and across Africa, and I thought what I would do is just share my personal story as an example of that, and then also share the stories of some of my students at Ashesi University. I grew up in Ghana, went to college in the United States, and then went on to work at Microsoft Corporation. And at some point, when I became a parent, I started to worry a lot more about Africa. In particular, it just seemed to me that people in my generation needed to be involved with changing Africa for the better for the sake of future generations. And so, really, what I set about to do was to contribute towards a renewed Africa, a new Africa. Now imagine that you are a young man or a young woman working in the West, in the diaspora. You don't have the same financial resources as somebody like Bill Gates, and you want to change a continent. When you start, how do you do it? For some people, they think, well, go start a company. Others might go into politics, as Arthur has done. Others might go work in the not-for-profit sector. Well, my initial thought was to start a software company. But then I did an interesting exercise where I went back to Ghana and had conversations with friends and family. And we would take lots of problems. Infrastructure, health, education, the rule of law, you name it, and ask the question, why is this the way it is? The economy. And for each of these problems, we would get a set of answers, and we would take each of those answers and ask, why? And as we drilled down this way, something sort of leapt up as fundamental to all problems, which was a crisis in leadership. And so leadership as defined by the people in positions of influence, the people who were making important decisions on what they were doing. They were either just accepting the status quo, or they were not problem solvers, or they were corrupt, frankly, some of them. And so then the question became, how do you change the leadership core of a nation? This is a very big question. And for me, the answer to that question, the search for the answer to that question took me to the educational system. And what I saw in education was narrow education and very didactic education. So education that was implemented in a way that just was about rote learning, just measuring recall of information. And very little emphasis at all on problem solving, not a lot of emphasis on ethics, and not a lot of emphasis on broad perspectives. Now, here's the truth, here's a fact. Problems do not come to us as accounting problems or engineering problems. They come as problems. And leaders who need to lead teams of people to solve these problems need to have a wide perspective. And so I concluded that in order to make a significant contribution, given my limited resources, I needed to engage with education. And I decided to tackle higher education in particular for a simple reason. My colleagues who studied computer science in Ghana did so by writing code on paper and graded on paper. They didn't write code on computers. People would study chemistry and not do any chemistry labs, and this seemed wrong. But there's a fact about higher education that really startled me. One was that I would walk onto university campuses and see kids standing on the verandas looking through windows for lectures because it was overcrowded. The second was that at the time, something like 2% of college-age kids were in college in Ghana. 2%. And today, it is still less than 5%. The problem with that number is it's too small, but also, by definition, the people in college today in Ghana are going to be running the country 30 years from now, when they're in their 50s, by definition. And so it seemed to me that if I could change the way those 20-year-olds were educated, I could create a sea change in a country. But as I said, when I started, I wasn't thinking about Ghana, I was thinking about Africa. And so that was the vision. And the strategy I just described, let's go change education, look at high quality education that is values-based, that is really fostering creativity, and that is empowering people to be problem solvers. Rote learning, fundamentally, is about looking backwards. I'll say that again. Rote learning is fundamentally about looking backwards, of always reading a textbook about what somebody else has discovered. What we need are people who look forward, who see a problem and can look forward in solving those problems. And so that's what I'm doing, and we've taken best examples from outside, but adapted to Africa and to our needs. And it's this institution we call the Shesi University, that uses a liberal arts approach so that 2 years out of the 4-year program is about broad thinking. A liberal arts core that includes the humanities, mathematics, social sciences, leadership seminars, and community service. And then majors in computer science and management. Those are the two that we started with. In the next 10 years, we're going to add engineering, economics, law, and society. And it is about creating a place and encouraging the youth to gather, to discuss problems, to go out there into the world and see the change that they can make in the world. And it is also about an effort that included a global community. We got a lot of funding from the United States, but we also got funding from Ghanaians. The people on my staff who contributed towards building our permanent campus. The campus was designed by Ghanaians and built by Ghanaians. And they did it at a world-class quality. And I feel that it is very important that we set an example of what we're capable of in order to encourage the youth to stand on our shoulders and reach even higher than we can do. And so they go out and they engage with their community and they see what a change that they can make. I've got to tell you that I'll tell you when I first recognized that we were on the right path. It was 3 weeks after we started classes. I walked into my office, I booted up my computer, and I opened my email. And the first message that I received was from a student who had been with us for just 3 weeks in our pioneer class. And he had written it in such big font that it filled my screen. And he said, "I am thinking now. I am thinking now." And he signs off, "Thank you." It's amazing what we can do when you switch on a mind. And that young man who sent me that email, I have followed very closely. He now works in a bank, and he's had several promotions, because one of the first things he did when he got into the bank was to go to his managers and say, we are serving only the rich here. What about the unbanked? What about the poor? How do we reach them? And he got that bank to get into the process, and he directed the process of getting them onto the internet and enabling mobile banking for that organization. He's making a huge change because he started to think about the change that he can make in the world. Ethics is central to everything that we do. It is absolutely crucial that the people who lead a continent are people that are trustworthy in every sense of the word. That they do what they say they will do, that they're not corruptible, they show up on time, but most of all, that they care deeply about the people that they lead, that they understand that leadership is service. That those of us who call ourselves leaders should really see ourselves as servants of a community. It is very important that the future leaders of Africa concern themselves with the future happiness of a continent. And so we focus on ethics. We've encouraged our students to take on this ideal of responsibility and integrity. And in 2008, they enacted a student-run honor system where they came to us and said, we will not cheat, we will not tolerate those who do, and we no longer proctor exams at Ashesi. We do not invigilate exams. Students are on their own. Now, unfortunately, there's some students who cheat. Fortunately, their peers hold them accountable. They're brought forward to a judiciary committee that includes students, faculty, and administrators, and they're held accountable for that. And this is a process that I think we should really see in all our educational institutions, where the young people devise a new code of being, a new code of ethics, to say, we are on a team together that is going to change the world. And we want everybody, we require everybody on our team to step up their game, to not be mediocre, to not be corrupt. If we can do that, then we can change the world. So the results are pretty good. We have 100% of our students get good jobs. 95% of them are staying on the continent. 5% are coming here and the United States for graduate education. But they're involved in a wide variety of things, in financial services, in technology. We have an alum who's led a peacekeeping squad in Liberia. He's now in Ivory Coast. He's contributing towards, the good of Africa. We have students who are alumni who are engaged in education and orphanages and so on. And these are examples, and students are coming from all over Ghana and from all over Africa. And so it is very instructive to see that when people are sort of inspired internally, that they do something because it is something that they care about, they can make a huge impact. I think that my story is one example. All of you gathered here today at Oxford have a responsibility to a continent. We all do. We all do. And I've got to admit to you that for quite a while, I sort of abdicated that responsibility. My 6th year in the United States, I said to myself, I will not go back to Ghana because I was having a lot of fun in technology. I was making a lot of money. But really, when I think about it, what am I going to say 30 years from now, when my son or my daughter are older, and they look back at the African continent? What would I say to them? That I was not part of the solution, that I was one of those who walked away. That is not the conversation I want to have. And so even for those of you who decide to stay, I want to sort of emphasize a point that's been already made today, that we all need to keep our eyes looking back at Africa. And we all need to keep our eyes looking forward at a future world in which Africa will be very different than it is today. I actually believe that 20, 30 years from now, when I pick up the Financial Times, or the New York Times, or when I turn on CNN to hear about what's going on in Africa, it'll be a very positive story. It'll be a different story than it is today. But it will be that because you and I are going to be engaged in a very deep way on a continent. That you and I are going to basically make it our business to be concerned about the future happiness of entire generations to come. Thank you.
We keep it around 5 minutes. We keep it around 5 minutes. 5 minutes? Yeah, because.
Of course, I have 5 minutes. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lefifi. I'm based in China, and I've been there for the last 5 years. When I decided to go to China, I had a career in South Africa, and I decided it seems that China-Africa relation is a hot topic right now, and a lot of international consultants were overcharging for their expertise in China. And I said, I want to understand China. And in the first year that I was there, I got a job with Stellenbosch University, and we conducted the only research that came out of Africa on China-Africa relations, which was going to be presented at OCA. And closer to that time, I had 2 questions. One from a student who didn't know what OCA was, and she had been studying in China for 3 years. The second question was from the economic council of one of the states in countries in Africa. A month before OCA, he didn't know what OCA was and which stage it was going to be in. We actually thought we had a problem, because in the China-Africa relation, you always have people giving an opinion who come from Africa, or Chinese who are in Africa, or Chinese in China, but never Africans in China. When you watch CNN and they talk about Africans in China, you see the traders in Mbong, you never see professionals, you never see students, you never see visitors. So we basically realized we're not part of the discussion, we're not creating opinion, and we're not part of the process to develop policy. At the moment, as Prime Minister spoke earlier, South Africa should be representing the whole of Africa. Africa is 1 billion customers, which means it's going to be a struggle for Africa's share of the market. But we don't actually represent any opinion in China. So what we did, we formed a network, which at that time did not exist, to create a suppository of African skills in China with the intention of making sure that they basically come back to Africa and contribute to policy making, or they become industry captains and contribute in the negotiations with China-Africa region. And usually China is accused of bullying Africa, but the situation is that African leaders allow it. They engage with China, they don't go prepared, they go to OCA, and only a month before, they start asking embassies about what is going on in China. So as an organization, we're lobbying to make sure that our members are part of this discussion towards OCA. Whenever governments negotiate or companies negotiate with China, we are part of that negotiation because we are China subject experts. We understand the language, we understand the culture, we understand all the tricks that the Chinese will come with. And also, we've been there long enough to realize how China developed and how China leverages on its own graduates to develop and to organize the continent. In about 35 years ago, when China started its economic reform, they sent their graduates to the we'll basically have targets for China and we'll develop Africa's agenda for China. At the moment, we're looking at statistical targets because China has all the statistics about how it leads Africa. At the moment, we have 6,000 students annually that are awarded scholarship. What happens to them in 3 months, where they are in 3 months, and how many of them actually graduate from China in 3 months. And this is Africa's responsibility. And we said that as an association that houses all the African graduates, we should actually set this target and decide that probably at the next World Cup, we want 1,000 graduates employed in Chinese companies in Africa and middle management government. And publish this as a target and an agenda for China. So we'll basically start simple, but we think it's a way to start and to put a little bit of pressure on African countries to do the same. Through either African Union or through African Association.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kangha Mbong. I am currently a BA Law and Anthropology student at LSE. I'd like to tell you a little bit about my experience prior to LSE because I believe that culminates, summarizes essentially who I am and the values that I have today. I think I've been driven by my experience in life. I'm Cameroonian by nationality, and coming from Cameroon, where there's a lot of division by ethnicity and also language due to the English-French divide. I was faced with a situation which was so precarious, and I decided that something needed to be done. Right at 13, I knew I wanted to be a politician, not because I liked the game of politics, but I knew that is where the weaknesses, and that's what is putting my country down, and that's where I can make a change. And just to give you a little bit about the sense of what I mean by a precarious situation. When I was 16, I took my GC O-levels, and I emerged as the best female performer in the country. And we've heard a lot about government scholarships today. There's nothing like a government scholarship in Cameroon. You would think such an achievement like that, and many others who were before me will be rewarded, but there's no sense of government involvement in rewarding youths, and so many youths get frustrated and they don't feel motivated to achieve anything. And at that point, I knew I had to do something. I knew I had to fight for what I wanted because the government wasn't going to help me out. So when I finished my A-levels, I got a scholarship from UCL. But that's when I heard about the African Leadership Academy in Johannesburg, South Africa. The African Leadership Academy, I believe, is a unique and I would say one of the best institutions in Africa at the moment that actively strives to recruit students, no matter their financial background, and transforms them into the next generation of African leaders. At the academy, for the first time, I met people who were not Cameroonian. It takes the model of the United World Colleges and transforms it, makes it even better. At the academy, I did subjects like leadership, entrepreneurship. I took languages, Swahili. You can take Arabic, French. There is so much to get engrossed in at the African Leadership Academy. I can say the experience really transformed me. And it not only gives you the normal curriculum, but it really relates it into practice. We had entrepreneurship, whereby students were given an opportunity to start up businesses on campus. I started a talk shop on campus. And that's the way forward for education for Africa, I believe. It's giving students practical experience as opposed to just regurgitating what you get, textbooks and what you get told by teachers. It's actually getting your hands on the job, learning things, doing practical experience that prepares you for life, for the future. And so from African Leadership Academy, I've gotten so much that I felt that it was the right time. But then I came to LSE, but that didn't stop me, because I think a lot of what happens is when youths from Africa come abroad to study, they think, oh my God, I have to wait until I graduate, then get a job, then get my master's, then get a PhD before I go back to Africa and start doing something. I want to challenge that line of thinking. I think you can start from any point. You just have to have, as the Prime Minister said, leadership is a decision. You have to make that decision, and you don't need a PhD to be able to make that decision. And so I started Youth for Change, and Youth for Change started as a blog because I believe in the power of social media and technology, the power it has to transform Africa. And it started as a blog whereby I just put out opportunities to youth in Cameroon and Africa at large, and engage them in articles on current events and culture, because I believe a lot of African culture is dying, which needs to be revived. And from a blog, I decided to transform it into an organization, but I didn't want to go down the route of the NGO models. So I decided to call it a grassroots organization. And I believe grassroots organizations have a role to play in Africa's future. And the topic today says youth leadership within and across Africa, African borders. And I think that's where organizations like Youth for Change come into play. I recently attended the Clinton Global Initiative University for one of my projects, which is Envision. A lot of time when we talk about youth, we often exclude youth who are disabled, and I think that is something that needs to be called into question. Because this, I had the first project I did was in a disabled center back in my hometown in Cameroon, and I was amazed to see the talent that these youths came up with. But because they are so isolated from society and almost segregated, they don't have a platform to develop those ideas and talents that they have. I believe that's something that needs to be looked more into. And so it's about making change so little, but I believe there's never anything that's very little. Any little thing that makes a change is a step towards Africa's future. And from my experience with Envision, I didn't have any capital, I didn't have any money, I'm still studying, but I just wrote an email to friends and family, and just from that little network, I was able to raise the money I needed to go back to my hometown and start a project. So it's not about having the money, it's about having the idea and being passionate enough to take the first step and say, I don't need a PhD to do this, I don't need an MBA, of course I want to get an MBA, but that's not what defines my potential, that's not what defines the abilities that I can, and the steps I can take to change my continent. So I think in all, I would like to conclude what Margaret Mead said. She said, never doubt that a group of talented and motivated citizens can change the world. And I think that is very true. And my experience at the African Leadership Academy has really taught me that that is really possible. I want to give you an example of 3 of my classmates at African Leadership Academy to demonstrate how they are changing the world, and I believe this trend continues. In the next 10 years, the future of Africa looks very bright. One of them he's called William Kampamba. I don't know if any of you in the audience have heard about him, but this is a young boy from Malawi who was recruited to the African. And this is one of the things about the African Leadership Academy. You don't need to have to be financially stable or to be wealthy to be recruited to the academy. You're recruited solely based on merit, on what you've done in your community. And he didn't go to school, but he went to the library because he was interested in physics and got books and just looked at windmills and was fascinated by windmills. And he got bicycles and broken parts and anything he could find, and he built a windmill and generated electricity for his village. I could go on and on quoting examples of my classmates at ALA. I was really inspired by my classmates, some of the brightest minds I've ever met, and I believe these are the kinds of initiatives, these are the kinds of, the African Leadership Academy is one of them, and there's so many other initiatives that should be encouraged, and this, I believe, is the key to unlocking Africa's potential, which I believe is the youth. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our three speakers. In a moment, I'm going to open up to kind of get questions from the floor. But I'd firstly like to kind of pick up on something that kind of Patrick said. And I was just wondering, like, if it was inevitable that like economic change would like naturally bring about culture change in Africa, what would your message be to people who might be fearful that kind of globalization will kind of act to the detriment of the African culture?
So that's a very good question. The way I see it, I think that economic development and culture are very closely intertwined. So if Africa does not advance, then our kids will all be watching MTV all the time. Economies that are strong project their culture onto economies that are not as strong. And so I feel that, when I talk about a renewal in Africa, I'm talking about an economic renewal, but also a cultural renewal. And that means that we ought to be teaching kids, our culture. There are lots of things that are in our culture that we're not paying enough attention to that we should. But I also believe that you can't do one without the other, right? So if we just focused on culture and ignored the economy, as I said, culture will decline.
Would you like to add? Right, cool. Thank you. Okay, and now I'm going to open it up to the floor. I'd like to remind you, as much as possible, to kind of keep to short, factual questions, please. Yes, so any hands from the audience? I'll try to get new people who haven't spoken. Yeah, could I get the one at the very back, please?
So, as I said at the beginning of my talk, the real motivation was just recognizing, when I saw another generation, I recognized that I needed to be part of the solution. But I've got to admit that even from that realization, I got up one morning and asked my wife, who's American, grew up in Seattle, and I asked her, what would you say if I said I'm going to quit Microsoft today, let's go to Ghana, let's get engaged with education? And she immediately said, yes, let's do it. And then I was in a quandary, right? So I sat up and I said, hey, don't you think we should think about this a little bit? and really, my hesitation was, I was afraid that I was going to get into something and not be successful at it, that this was going to be a failure, and I'd have wasted my time, and not to mention the personal pain that one feels when one fails. But at some point, as I was grappling with this question, it dawned on me that if I didn't even make the attempt, then I'd have failed anyway. And so failure started, it seemed like, oh man, I'm in trouble no matter which way I go. I might as well give it a try. So that's what motivated me to get moving on it.
Any more questions? Could I get in the orange jumper, and then we'll jump across to you. Yeah. Was there somebody over there? Yeah. So 2 questions from me there.
Thank you. To answer the first question about ALA not targeting elite who are able to afford the fees, because the fees are quite high. When I had to go to the academy, the total of the 2 years was $30,000, which is quite that's quite a lot. Actually, was on scholarship to go to ALA because I wasn't able to afford it. And I understand your concerns in that a lot of elite are ALA. I think the balance, there has to be a balance because ALA, I should have mentioned, is non-profit. And so the organization works solely on, partly on the fees that students are able to pay and then on grants from donors. So I think the founders have done a good job of finding a balance whereby you have majority of the students not paying fees, being on scholarship, and you have some students who come from other countries, which also adds to the diversity, who come from America, from the UK, Turkey, Lebanon, and other African countries who are able to afford these fees. I think it adds to the diversity of the academy. And I think hopefully in the future, if more African entrepreneurs and African businessmen who have who are successful can actually get on board, then I think it will contribute to the academy's goal of recruiting more students who will not be able to afford the academy. Regards to the second question on getting on ground in Cameroon, Cameroon in terms of the system is very bureaucratic, and as I mentioned before, there's this divide between English and French, and I'm from the English-speaking part, and that already creates kind of like a barrier. You're seen as almost kind of like an enemy, being in the minority. But I think I took, you have to take a structure, a kind of, you have to be strategic, and you also have to be ready for any challenges that come your way. There's a lot of bribery and corruption that has become commonplace in Cameroon almost. It's called you have to wet the hands by giving cash. I think you have to be able to stand up to those kinds of stereotypes and those kind of structures that further destroy what is left of the governance, if there is any, in Cameroon. So I think it's just being able to have a set of values and stick to those values no matter what. Sometimes it does come at a cost, but I think if you have a set of values and you're really to push your point no matter what, then it should be.
Okay, if we make this the final round of questions. Oh, sorry.
I know everyone is having a long afternoon, so I'm just going to ask the final question to all of the panelists. If you could just keep your responses succinct. This question comes from Denver, Colorado, in the United States, and he is originally from Uganda. Sorry, Matt, does this say Helen? Helen O.T., so she. What type of youth leadership training do the panelists consider most effective in integrating youth from post-conflict societies into the globalized world? Thank you.
Well, some of our students got engaged with the Liberian refugee camp near Accra. Former child soldiers, and initially they'd been asked to go and help with sort of conflict resolution. But they got there and decided, look, actually what these people really need is support running their micro businesses. And so instead they gave them they designed a course to help them run their businesses better. It was hugely popular. And they've been invited back to continue this work. I think that we need to look forward. And the reality is, as the governor of the care about their economic well-being, and we need to pay a lot of attention to that. In severe cases where, you know, you've got post-traumatic stress and things like that, you need help and intervention as well. But I would say that just from experiences looking, and we have some Liberian students in the Shesi, and I think just educating people and preparing them for a rewarding life and fulfilling life is the best thing that we can do.
My experience is a little bit limited coming from South Africa. I think the kind of training that was offered in South Africa was about the situation of opening up the schools that were previously disadvantaged. And I think at the moment we still have a lot of South African students that are not educated from the past era, and the Minister of Education believes in non-tertiary education and technical skills to build the economy and to integrate young people in SME development at macro level. And I think that's one of the best ways to give youth confidence to make them part of the economy and, you know, provide certain concessions that are specific for youth from the disadvantaged environment.
And in addition to what fellow panelists have said, I think also providing a platform for these youth to be able to express their views. Because I think there's a lot of danger in post-conflict situations to suppress feelings of hate and which later manifest in a negative form. So I think platforms such as youth parliaments can be a useful tool in enabling these youths to voice their concerns in a way that doesn't spill into violence, but in a constructive and productive way. And also using summer camps to get, you can use them as training, training them in leadership skills, entrepreneurship skills. And also, I think one thing that Africa really needs is a mini CGI from my experience with the Clinton Global Initiative. I think Africa needs that kind of platform whereby youth from all over Africa and professionals as well come together and engage in a dialogue on the way forward for the continent. Such dialogues lead to a birth of new ideas, and I think those kinds of initiatives should be encouraged in the African continent.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Can we show our appreciation to the three panelists?